You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. One of the main reasons that I do this podcast is to question different life choices in terms of how much freedom they give me and how much freedom I see them giving other people too. And by life choices, I mean some of the basic decisions that we get to make about things like career and relationships and so forth. So I've done episodes on the past questioning things like home ownership and questioning ownership of loads of stuff versus minimalism. And I've also done a lot of episodes questioning different career choices, entrepreneurship, unjobbing, and this kind of thing. And I do this because I find it really valuable and exciting and stimulating to think about the life choices that I'm making and to try and question what my options are and think about whether or not some of the most widely adopted choices make sense to me. Does it really make sense to buy a house? Does it really make sense to own a car, to pursue a job, career, working for somebody else, and these kinds of things? And in some ways, I've made very different decisions from what you might call the norm, which I hope is interesting for you to hear about. Some of my life choices have been unusual, like, for example, pursuing minimalism and a lifestyle of perpetual travel and starting my own business and pursuing financial independence and many other things that I talk about that are somewhat unusual. So I'm trying to tell you about choices that I've made and things that I'm thinking about, but also interview other people who've made different choices that I feel like I can learn from and explore and open my own mind up to other options that might be interesting for me too. So that's one of the key aims of The Voluntary Life. And in this episode, and in some episodes to come, I'm going to question another really key aspect or life choice, which is the choice about education. How much education does it make sense to get? How valuable is education? And does education lead to greater freedom and fulfillment in life? So in this episode, I'm going to tell you about some of the different approaches and ideas to education that I have been reading about. 3 different views on education. And I want to give you an overview of these 3 different views. A traditional view, a kind of rebel view, and what I will call a realistic view from different authors that I have been reading about recently. And I also want to give some thoughts on my own experience with education and share some of my own thoughts about it, because in many ways, education has worked really well for me. I have a PhD and I have used my education in starting a business, and so in many ways, education has definitely benefited me. At the same time, I also have some quite mixed feelings about education, and I can see some downsides in some of the criticisms of the way that the education system works. So I'm thinking about that a lot, especially because now that I'm a parent, this is a very big live topic for myself and my wife to think about in terms of our responsibilities towards our daughter. So that's what I'm going to cover in this episode. And I hope this will be an interesting introduction to questioning education. And I will be doing more episodes where I go into more depth about some of the really fascinating books that I've read recently about education. Before we get to that, though, I just want to say thank you to my new patrons on Patreon. They are Alan S., Jonathan B., and Joel B. I really appreciate my listeners who've chosen to support me through Patreon. They're helping to make this project of Doing the Voluntary Life sustainable and pay for the editing and hosting and all the other expenses that it takes to run the Voluntary Life. And if you too would like to help support the show, you can get many bonuses and rewards by doing so, including bonus episodes every week. I've just put out a bonus episode called My Favorite Entrepreneurship Documentaries. And if you listen to that one, it will keep you busy on Netflix for a very long time. So if you're interested in supporting the show, you can find out more by going to my website, thevoluntarylife.com, or directly to my Patreon page, which is at patreon.com/thevoluntarylife. And I'll also put a link in the show notes, which you can find directly on your podcast player. So on to this week's show. I want to tell you about 3 different views of education that I have gathered from different books and articles and videos that I've been watching about this topic. The first view I'm sure you are very familiar with. It's the kind of traditional view of education. And the idea is that education makes you a better and more enlightened person. It teaches you vital skills. It's the path to success in life. And as a parent, your responsibility really is, according to this traditional view, to push your kids to do well in school, go to college, get a great education, and go forward and achieve great success using that education. And according to this traditional view of education, this is a way that parents can give their kids a better start in life than they had. This is one of the really important things that you can do for your kids, is to make sure that they get a good education and give them a good start in life. So that's the traditional view. Then there's what I'm going to call the rebel view of education. And this view is expressed by many people, but the person that I think of when I think about this view is the entrepreneur called James Altucher, who's written many articles arguing that college is a total rip-off and not worth your time. And this rebel view of education is basically to question the traditional view, especially with regard to college. And the argument is that when you go to college, you don't learn useful skills. You learn outdated things that are not actually going to help you in your career and are unrelated to the incredibly fast-moving economy and fast-changing job landscape out there anyway. And in the modern economy, you're going to reinvent yourself a number of times during your career anyway. And apart from the lack of useful skills in this rebel view of education, another real criticism is that college, particularly in the US, is increasingly so expensive that as a financial proposition, it just doesn't make sense. You're going to go into massive debt to get a degree that doesn't really give you good skills, and you're going to change your career many times anyway. And so, as a parent, adopting this kind of rebel view, if you were to adopt this view, then, like James Altucher, you might discourage your kids from going to college. And in fact, that's what James Altucher did. He tried to persuade his kids not to bother with it, although apparently his daughter did end up going to college. And I think there are some very interesting ideas in that critique of education that I am mulling over as well. But there's a third view of education that I want to tell you about, which is something that I'm going to call the realist view of education. And it's one that I find very interesting. And in a way, it's a hard pill to swallow, this realist view, because it sort of takes elements from the traditional view and the rebel view and combines them together in a way. And the person that I'm thinking of who is a real proponent of this view is the economist Bryan Caplan, who has just written a book called The Case Against Education. And he makes the argument in this book that, yes, the education system is an enormous waste of time, and that the vast majority of what you get taught in the education system, in school and college, isn't useful skills, although you do learn some useful skills, and he estimates that about 20% of your time is probably spent learning useful skills and 80% not. So he argues that it's true in this rebel view that you're not learning useful skills, but that's actually not what the education system is for. The education system is to give you credentials to show an employer that you are employable. And there's a whole theory to explain how this works called signaling. I'm going to go into a lot more detail about that in a future episode when I do a review of Bryan Caplan's book. But the point is, in this realist view, Bryan Caplan sees a lot of massive problems with the education system, but still looking at the potential benefits to you as a student, he argues that it is still worth it if you are a good student, in terms of the payback that you will get through being able to find a better paying job and having a better career in future. And his argument is that the purpose of the education system is not to teach you skills, but to certify that you are a good worker. And not just in terms of intelligence, but in terms of other qualities like diligence and conformity, your work ethic and your ability to get on with other people and take instruction from your superiors. So according to this view, education is something that, as a parent, you would tailor your advice to your kids. If your kids are good at passing exams and can handle passing exams, then basically the education system is worth it to them in terms of their potential payoff in future through earning more money in the labor market. But it's not worth it if they're going to drop out of college, for example, or if they hate school and college so much that it's going to be a real struggle for them to get through it. So these are 3 different views that I'm mulling over at the moment. And my purpose here is not to argue for any one of them. I am very interested in Bryan Caplan's views, the sort of realist view, because I think in a way, it takes elements of both the traditional idea of education and this rebel critique of education from people like James Altucher. But I'm not trying to make the case for Bryan Caplan's views, and I do have some questions or criticisms that I'll go into more detail about when I review his book in detail. But my aim is more just to question the value of education and to share with you these different perspectives on it that I'm thinking about at the moment. Because as I said in the beginning, I am an example of somebody who did incredibly well from the education system. I have a first-class bachelor's from Bristol University. I have a Master of Science with distinction from University of College London, and I have a PhD from University College London. So I've spent a huge amount of time in education, and especially in postgraduate education. And I'm quite unusual in that I did actually use some of the things that I studied in my postgraduate education in my career. I started a pedestrian movement consulting business, advising architects and developers and local councils on how to improve building designs and urban designs for pedestrian flows, how to get enough foot traffic in the right places in your new building or street network. And my consultancy was based on things that I had actually learned in university. And this is apparently quite rare according to the statistics. Most people don't use anything that they've learned about their particular subject from university in their working lives at all, whereas I did, and it worked out really well for me. Now, although it worked out really well for me, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work out really well for everyone. I mean, for example, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a great idea for my daughter to follow the kind of educational path that I took. So I'm going to end this episode by just sharing a few thoughts with you about some of the reasons why I think it did work for me and some of the downsides that I also see to the education system as a whole. So first of all, I was able to get very good grades during my education system. I understood fairly early on that it was kind of a game and that a lot of the stuff I was being taught was stupid, but I knew how to get good grades and I was quite a, quote, good student in that sense. So I didn't have any problem jumping through the hoops of the education system. I found it quite easy to do. And that is not the same for everyone. So that's one thing that I think was definitely in my favor. I think related to that is that I came out of my education with zero debt, and that's partly because I was able to get loads of scholarships. So again, because I was able to get good grades, it meant that I was in a really good position to get scholarships, especially for the postgraduate degrees that I did, the Master of Science and the PhD. Now, it would have been very different if I had racked up massive debts doing the degrees that I did. Another important reason why the education system really worked for me was that I ended up choosing highly commercially relevant things to study, especially in my postgraduate degrees. So I only realized this once I'd already gone to university. I originally studied economic history at undergraduate level, and I realized fairly quickly into my undergraduate course that a lot of the stuff that I was studying wasn't going to be at all relevant in the world of work. And I actually tried to change my degree halfway through my first year, but I realized that it was too late to switch and I would have to restart a year, which I didn't want to do. But I got focused on the idea of trying to get useful training out of my university life. And so I ended up doing a master's that was extremely vocational. In fact, the MSc that I did included a work placement in a business. And so, I mean, it was very much tailored towards the property development industry and very much a kind of work-oriented master's course. And then I did a PhD, and I managed to do a PhD in a particular area of research and with a particular research team that was doing commercially highly relevant stuff in terms of the kind of computer simulations that they were developing. These were very useful, interesting technologies that could be directly used in commercial life. And that's how come I was able to take what I had learned at university and apply it in developing a business of my own, which I think is very unusual. As I said before, according to a lot of what I've read, most people use virtually nothing of what they learned in university in their job. So having said all of that, I still do feel like I wasted an enormous amount of time in university. A lot of my experience of both school and university was simply about getting credentials rather than being taught useful stuff. I also feel like I had to unlearn a lot of the stupid stuff that I was taught both in school and university. And as well as having a lot of time wasted in school and university in terms of the actual time I spent bored in lessons and lectures, I also feel that the social life associated with school and university was on balance negative for me. I did have a lot of fun during my years in education, but I wouldn't attribute that to school and university because in school, for example, I was bullied. I went to very violent schools and I generally just did not have a good time for a lot of my school years. And in university, the social side of things was, I found quite disappointing, just mainly because the nihilistic drinking that's the basis of university culture in the UK got old pretty quickly for me. I found it kind of boring. Getting drunk gets old pretty fast, or at least it did for me. So I don't have a lot of nostalgic memories about school and university in terms of social life. The best times that I had were outside school and university. And I did meet good friends through school and university, but again, I would say on balance, I would call it a negative. So I've got a lot of criticisms of education too, and a lot of doubts and thoughts about it. And that's why I'm exploring these different perspectives. I hope you found it interesting to hear my overview of these different views on education. And I will be doing more questioning of education in further parts of this series, especially when I look in detail at some of the things that have been written about education by critics like Bryan Caplan, which I'll cover in future episodes. So that's all for this week's episode. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, I hope you have a great week.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.